Good afternoon and welcome to the next Future Leaders Group lunchtime training session. A little bit about the Future Leaders Group of OpenUK. We are a collection of individuals who are interested in open technologies, including open source software, open hardware, and open data. We include a wide range of people that work in technology, intellectual property, outsourcing, procurement, data, coding, and innovation, as well as private practice lawyers and in-house counsel that work in the technology sector and related fields. The Future Leaders Group operates under the direction of OpenUK's Legal and Policy Committee, and we have a clear purpose to bring together and develop future leaders in legal and policy matters relating to open technologies and to support and further the mission of the Legal and Policy Committee. The Future Leaders Group is currently co-chaired by me, Robert Grinnells, I'm from Field Fisher, and Katie Gibson from Bristow's, and we're both lawyers advising on technology and commercial matters. The Future Leaders Group is always open to new ideas and to new members, so whether you'd like to get involved in all our activities or just like to dip in and out of our various projects. And I'm delighted to say today that we are joined by Charles Schulz, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of Vates SAS and board member and the Open Information Security Foundation. Thanks for joining us today, Charles. I think today you'll be talking about freedom, security, and community.
Absolutely. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for attending this meeting. So today I'll be discussing a topic which is seldom discussed actually in circles, and which is, I wouldn't say necessarily complex, but it isn't something which usually is being talked about without some sort of passion or perhaps even misunderstanding. So today I'll basically be telling you about free and open source software and cybersecurity. So without further ado, I'll just be unveiling this rather narcissistic slide. So just to tell you about who am I, what I'm doing, I'm currently the head of strategy at Vates, as a French free and open source software vendor specialized on virtualization solutions. Besides that, I'm also a board member of the OISF. OISF stands for the Open Information Security Foundation, and you may be absolutely forgiven if you have never heard about this open source foundation. It is basically the open source foundation behind something called Suricata, and Suricata is an idea, so it's basically a network probe and network monitoring tool. Besides that, and before that, I used to work at ANSSI. ANSSI is, roughly speaking, the French equivalent of the GCHQ, where I was an expert on free and open source software and cloud computing, among other things. And in the longer past, I've also been one of the co-founder of the Document Foundation, which is a foundation supporting the LibreOffice project. Now, freedom versus security, because when we talked about open source software, there's a general notion that open source software is, of course, much better than proprietary software when it comes to security. And really, that since we stand for freedom and openness, we shouldn't really have to bother too much about the security aspect. It's all being taken care of because, we're the good guys, right? But, well, it's actually more complex than that. And in fact, we may take as a starting point a conundrum, which can be roughly pictured or phrased in the following way: freedom versus security, or freedom and security. And I'm part of the people who, at least in the field of cybersecurity, we actually believe you can have both and eat your cake too. So let's see how and why that could be and that should be the case. Now, cybersecurity has become really a big thing ever since, I would say, 2010. But really, when you go back in time, what you're finding out is that the first virus, the first worm, if you will, was actually invented practically in 1971. And it was really doing one thing, which is that it was basically displaying this message, which you can see on the right side of the screen. It was displaying this sentence on your screen at that time: "I am the creeper, catch me if you can." And that was the very first virus, computer virus. It was called the creeper virus, and it was, it started to proliferate in 1971. Pretty harmless, if you ask me. Certainly, in a sense, it was more of a proof of concept than anything else. Then you basically had the very first IBM, because that was a virus that happened in the IBM, on the IBM computing platform. Fast forward a few years after that, and it was an IBM-only virus. It was basically the first computer virus that was running and working on personal computers, and it was basically hijacking the boot sequence. But it was basically more complex, and it was more something of a it was just a smarter virus, let's just put it that way. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is that, yes, indeed, when you are using software, irrespective of open source, of its open source proprietary nature, when you're relying on the network, you are essentially facing risks. You do not have to be obsessed by those things. You do not have to be scared, but you only need to be concerned that, in fact, when it comes to software network, the level, the complexity, the ferocity, and the sheer number of dangers are only increasing with time. And in fact, just to show you a little bit what we're talking about, if we only basically consider the year 2019, these are roughly official figures. So in terms of front losses, we're talking about $3.5 billion lost to cybercrime in 2019. This, by the way, does not take into account companies who have shut down because they were the victims of cyber attacks. So this is basically the front costs of cybercrime in 2019. Then you have 7 million data record breaches daily in 2019. If you want to think about this, just think about each line that you could think about in all of the Lord of the Rings saga. Now, if you take that book, or those books, and you basically count the number of lines, well, you compare that to the number of 7 million, and you will have an idea of how big and what we're talking about is. So then we also have 8.5 million distributed denial of services, which is roughly the most basic attacks we can think of, also that same year. And, just to show you how dynamic this sector is, just in 2019, we have $250 million lost to deepfake scams. And deepfake scams are not supposed to be a very old trick. It's actually rather modern and rather up and coming. So we already are facing 200, that sum of money in terms of damage. This is pretty bad. And yeah, so as I said, there's those figures keep on increasing. And then we have another thing, because so far I've mentioned computer viruses and cybercrime. This is a great friend of the United Kingdom, as far as I can remember, but he is concerned too by cyber attacks. And the reason he and we all should be concerned by cyber attacks is that not only is there crime, there is also cyber warfare, and nation states can actually attack other nation states in the cyberspace. And this is an actual thing. This happens, and in terms of complexity, it is often much more ferocious and subtle and sophisticated than the basic level of cyber criminality that you could encounter. This, in turn, creates much more complex dynamics between states, but also between companies, software vendors, cloud service providers, and nation states, democratic or not. And then you may ask, what about software freedom and openness? Because after all, I'm talking to, within the framework of OpenUK. So what about software freedom and all that? Well, it's not because we don't hear too much about this notion that it doesn't matter. In fact, I'd say that it is quite the contrary. Because you see, free software and free and open source software still are at the underlying, they still form the underlying basis and nature of most of the cybersecurity tools, which is something that we should all think about, both in terms of defensive tools and in terms of less defensive tools and offensive tools. So you may then think, oh, well, that's all fine and good. Free and open source software is actually existing and thriving in that space. And we know that free and open source software is inherently more secure than proprietary software. Well, guess what? It just may not be the case. Because just a few years ago, in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, 2015, something rather ridiculously important happened. It was called the Heartbleed vulnerability. Now, I don't know if you remember the Heartbleed vulnerability, so let me refresh your memory. Heartbleed was essentially a simple vulnerability located in one of the core SSL libraries, which is open source. So it happened in OpenSSL. And OpenSSL is essentially a component that you find not just all across the internet. Think about websites, web servers, security software, payments, payment processors, payment processing software, everything. It is basically all around the place. It is in ATMs, it is in airplanes, it is in pretty much everywhere and everything. And so the vulnerability itself was remarkably trivial to patch, but it had not been detected, even though it was an open source software project. Essentially because, it was so ridiculous, I guess, that it was not something that the original developers were necessarily looking at. But also because those same original developers simply did not have the material resources to spend all their professional time working on OpenSSL. They had to do other jobs, basically just to pay the rent. So that is another problem when it comes to open source software, but let's just stick for a moment on Heartbleed. So what that showed, that and several other episodes and several other incidents, several other vulnerabilities, what that showed was essentially that the notion that open source software is inherently secure than proprietary software is either subject to heavy debate or at least just has been disproven. I will tell you what I think at the end of the presentation, but that certainly shook up a lot of things in the IT industry in general. We had the rather welcome and ginormous initiative from the US government and the Linux Foundation, Google, I think Facebook as well, and a few other companies. What happened was that they funded something called the Common Infrastructure Initiative, put a bunch of money in it, and what they said was, okay, we're going to go and survey every one of these basic infrastructure software, from the NTP time server to SSL, and we're going to essentially make sure that the developers behind it are fully paid, that they can basically do their security watch, that they can continue and keep on working on those software stacks, so that such a thing as Heartbleed never happens again. Other initiatives emerged, such as LibreSSL, for instance, from the OpenBSD Foundation. But essentially there was quite a shake-up in the community and the industry at large because of Heartbleed. And this was much welcome, but at least it did change, I think, the nature of the discussion. Now, having said that, we should be perhaps reviewing exactly what we mean in terms of, first of all, the claim that free and open source software is inherently more secure, and we should also be discussing how security management, if you will, happens within an open source project or an open source community. So, as you know, openness, access to the code, involvement with a broader software ecosystem, community, are hallmarks of open source software projects, and that's all well and good. But how does that translate with respect to security and security vulnerabilities? Well, the first thing we have to say is that because you have access to the code in openness, what this essentially means is that you basically enable public scrutiny of the code. So anybody can take a look at the code and review it for security flaws, existing or, well, of course, to perhaps even insert some. But I would say that's exactly the same with proprietary software in the sense that you can also try to see how you can find undiscovered vulnerabilities. Anyway, coming back to my first point. So you have public scrutiny, which is good because then what you can do is essentially analyze the code and identify potential vulnerabilities. Any serious open source project will have the following as well. Security review process, meaning actually the code is reviewed by its developers for bugs, of course, and security vulnerabilities. And of course, if there's such a thing, you can basically have, let's say, you can open an issue, and they will open an issue, and they will deliver a patch. Then you have a security management process. In case a vulnerability has been discovered, whether by a third party or within the community itself, you're going to have some sort of a process where the developers or one specific developer in the project will take care of accepting or developing a specific patch for that will essentially fix the vulnerability. But that just requires at least a minimal constant and permanent process. And so that's a security management process, if you will, because it starts with the discovery of the vulnerability, the communication of that vulnerability itself, to the issuing of a patch. Then what you also should have is an active security watch. That may not be the case for every open source project out there. I'd say the most important one certainly have people taking a look or at least receiving some sort of regularly scheduled information about security watch and vulnerability advisories. And they even issue, some of those projects even issue their own security advisories, which is even better because then it goes downstream to downstream distributors or downstream integrators or users of that software. And there, what you basically have is an illustration of what it means to get involved with a broader ecosystem. Now, this is how it's supposed to work, and in theory, just as in practice, this is how it should work and how it works. Why then, you may ask, do we have things such as Heartbleed and any really other major vulnerabilities still popping up at any given interval of time? Well, it is because software development and software development in general is not perfect. It is a human endeavor. It is by no means an industrial process yet. And, which is probably even more important, nobody's perfect. So what really matters is how you as an open source project are facing and can face a challenge related to security and the discovery of the vulnerability. But once you have that, once you make sure and once you know that all these things are actually working, then what you basically have is a rather functioning open source project with respect to security, and what you basically have is maybe not a secure software, but you are developing a software that people can trust, which is probably just as important, if not more important. Now, we're going to talk about a little known aspect of how those things work. Because you see, it may be surprising if I were to tell you that, yes, when it comes to vulnerability discoveries and management, even in open source projects, you're going to have moments in time where some of that information is actually not available publicly, meaning it can sit and can be shared only by very few developers, very few members of the project. And this for a good reason. It is that in between the vulnerability disclosure and the issuing of a patch, there may be security considerations that prime over the openness and access to code and information. So of course, the code is at any moment in time completely open, completely public, completely available, but the very information that there is a specific vulnerability affecting this or that part of the code is not going to be necessarily public until the project or some other third party produces a patch for security reasons. And that does happen, especially when the vulnerability is critical. The reason for this is very simple. You do not want to let out an information that could essentially be disclosed to potential attackers that could then essentially take advantage of that vulnerability and amplify the critical nature and the critical impact of that vulnerability. So this happens in almost every open source project that I know of. Maybe the smaller ones do not necessarily have this sort of process in place, but certainly this happens in between Linux distributions. That happens, pretty much for every major and standard open source software you might think of. And essentially, this does require that your project has enough developers who know and who can follow this kind of confidentiality and disclosure management, both of the vulnerability and the delivery of a patch fixing that vulnerability. So, where I'm trying to go with this, now that we have basically reviewed how security management happens within an open source project, I'd like to sort of take a step back and discuss a little bit about culture. Culture as in our shared culture of open source and open source values. Now, you may know the one person in one of these two pictures is Edward Snowden. Of course, I will not be introducing him at this point, of course, because you've all heard about it. Now, I'm not sure you know the other guy on the other picture. Well, he's also an amazing open source software contributor, just like actually Edward Snowden is. So the name of the guy in the other picture, his name is Martin Roche. He's American, and he is the original author of a software called Snort. Snort, just like the pigs are snorting. Snort is a network security tool, which is very famous for security professionals. It's an IDS, so it's an intrusion detection software, just like Suricata is. And the reason I wanted to put his picture there is to tell you that you basically can share a common culture. Those two guys are American, and they're heavily involved in cybersecurity, and they're major experts when it comes to software and open source software. But one had the fate that you all know about, and this is Edward Snowden. The other one had a completely different fate. He's alive, and assumedly he's pretty happy. He essentially developed Snort then that the company that was supporting Snort was acquired by a major cybersecurity company called FireEye, and then FireEye got in turn acquired by Cisco. And this is a man who now, has all the considerations and respect and professional credentials you might think of. But he chose a path which is to continue working within cybersecurity, both with the private sector and the public sector, aka the federal government. And this is still open source software. Edward Snowden did something completely different, which many of us certainly do admire. But essentially, at the end of the day, you have different perspectives on open source software and the openness of information and freedom of information and software freedom. But then it's still encompassed within one culture. And I think this is very important to understand that cybersecurity is not something that goes against software freedom and open source software. It is just something that coexists and that is essentially inherent to open source software and software freedom. It's just how you manage it, I would say. Now, I said the word culture many times, and I think this is essentially key for it, because at the end of the day, the key point, I think, is to understand that a secure open source software, a secure free software, is fundamentally a stronger software, and it's a more trustable software. It is a software that we can all rely on, and that will, in the end, enable more freedom and openness for everyone, for the ecosystem, for the community. Voila, thank you. If you have any question, I'm available.
Thanks so much, Charles. Is there any questions? I have any questions.
So is it okay if I ask the question?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Thank you. They haven't made the call today, but I was speaking to somebody in a UK utilities company who I assume will download this afterwards and listen to it. And they, I think, are a bit behind the curve in utilities, actually, because they haven't been using open source, but they've just started to. And their legal team, it's always the lawyer's fault, the legal team is pushing back and making it difficult for them to use it because they're concerned about security. If they were to come to you, what would be the sort of 3 bullet points or, short piece of advice that you would give them in speaking to their lawyers to convince them that open source doesn't mean something is insecure?
Sure. So the first thing I would tell them is you need to make your software secure, because I don't know what kind of utilities that person is or that business is in, but you're either going to poison people with public water systems, or you're going to deprive hospitals from electricity, or you're going to have a nuclear power plant blow off. So when we're talking about cybersecurity in general and utilities, we need to be extraordinarily cautious and extraordinarily fanatic about this. I can tell you that one day my former director general, the present director general of French equivalent of GCHQ, and my former boss, he once told us, cybersecurity and utilities, that is the one thing that keeps me awake at night. Just knowing that something could happen, because this is going to affect us all, our families, our thing. No, it's not just going to be the email of the guy or the CEO that got scammed. This is nothing to do in terms of impact. Now, what I could tell that person who is in the utilities business, the first thing is, I think we need to recognize that he or she may work in an industry that essentially relies a lot on standardization and standards openness, I would say. So what open source software is, and why open source software may be more, let's say, desirable for this industry, is essentially that open source software is more trustable or more trustworthy. It isn't inherently more secure than proprietary software, but if he or she does not know what's inside the cybersecurity software that's supposed to protect the utilities this person is managing, then I think there's a level of trustworthiness that will never be achieved. Whereas with open source software, and sorry to say this, but with properly supported open source software, then I think everything, this person will be able to essentially achieve maximum of satisfactory risk management, and I think that's key. What is not going to work, though, is unsupported open source software, because guess what? It's free. Well, it's not free. Open source software and free software has actually never been free as in beer. Somebody is coding it. Somebody is relying on its own time to do this. And you need to have resources to ensure that there's a proper maintenance of the software. And by the way, this person working in utility, they know the word maintenance. They understand very, very, very well what it means, maintenance. So so it's essentially, I think that's what I would say. Also, an interesting point is that when it comes to utilities, the utility companies and businesses are getting increasingly connected these days. This was not a case even 5 years ago. Even to this, you would go into an electricity power plant, no matter what its energy source might be, and literally nothing would be connected. These days, they're not connecting necessarily everything, but they're connecting parts of their information systems and even production systems. You're muted.
Charles, I have a question.
Yeah, sorry. It's interesting. I've watched what the LF are doing around utilities starting to pull together their energy project. And I think that security risk is a little bit like the automotive sector and the lawyers there, the initial reaction to strict liability. It's unsurprising that the reaction is we don't want anybody to be able to access this and change it. But the balance, the quid pro quo, is the transparency, and I suppose also interoperability. I wonder, just as a follow-up to that, the work that the Commission's doing is something, we've got someone here from France talking to us today, the work the Commission's doing to open up the infrastructure used by all public sector across Europe is particularly interesting to OpenUK. And I wonder if you've seen much in that around security. How are they dealing with the security aspects of that?
I think what they're, from my perspective, public sector, the use of public sector in when it comes to open source is, I would say, they're either going through vendors and it's great, or they're not going through vendors and they're developing or they're operating those software themselves, and in which case I can only hope they're keeping their software up to date, at least in terms of stable versions receiving security patches and upgrades. But I would say it's a bit complicated, I think, for a lot of people inside the public sector to properly manage anything when it comes to software security, essentially because they're, at least in France, you got extremely constraining public tender systems in which when you're you're basically tendering for open source software, you end up being supported by an IT services company, and you can only hope this is the company that is going to be serious about security maintenance. So I would say that I'm not entirely satisfied with how that works in that sector.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of the things the Commission has really hung up on And at the 2-day workshop they did last year, I don't think the report ever came out. It was meant to pre-pandemic, but I don't think it did. I assume it will get rolled into the work OFE and Fraunhofer are doing now, which comes out in January. But that was one of the big things, was making sure that the open source was supported and maintained, and how you could buy at scale when you're looking at smaller projects. So I suppose conglomerates of those being pulled together, or SI type environments. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. You're welcome.
Someone else had another question. Is that?
Yeah, Charles.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. I have a question. Great talk. Thank you. I have a question going back to, I think it might have been your slide 9, where you talked about kind of a good open source projects. They're going to have this kind of security review and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent do you see the security of a project as a tooling or development process? And to what extent do you see it as a good governance policy process?
That is the question of a man who's completely new to the field of open source software, as we can see. I don't know. You see,
let me give you a different way of thinking about it.
Okay.
If you came across a project that appeared to have kind of a security policy,
mm-hmm.
but you know it's the way the whole project globally is managed was kind of not great, not transparent, would you still say that that project is secure and trustworthy? Or would you say, okay, there are actually different axes of consideration? There's the security of the code itself. There's the different tools that they use. Are these tools adequate tools? There's the openness policy of the governance. I mean, what type of, I guess that's the question, you know, how do all of these come into play for you?
Well, I think, so I understand that question a little bit more. Okay, so I think these tend actually to be relatively independent in my experience, because you know the way open source projects are run can vary a lot. Let me give you an example with a project I'm currently working on a lot, or rather, in which the company that I'm working for is heavily involved with. It's a very old open source project. It's called the Xen project. Pretty large project. It exists within the Linux Foundation, and it does have an active developer base. It received bad press of sorts. It's been receiving bad press for some years because some people decided that KVM was really the best thing possible in the market. And you know, it's typically a project that I think, I'm talking about the Xen project, that did not involve in terms of tooling. If you want to be a Xen developer, well, you're going to have to be rather experienced. They provide you with all sorts of resources for you to learn, but you know, it's rather down to the kernel and to the processor architecture. So it's not exactly, it's not exactly JavaScript. You know? And I think that what happens is that for some reason, the Xen project developers did not, now the big talk right now inside the Xen project is a potential move to GitLab. You know, if you go into the Xen project, what you will see is a wiki and how to handle patch management through mailing lists. So in terms of tooling, you could say this is even suboptimal in a sense. But it is a fundamentally functioning project. And when it comes to security, the Xen project is impeccable. They have an extremely active security watch. They have a solid security management process. They're talking to the broader ecosystem. They do security reviews. You can have public threading on code. So you have all these things. And so it is a highly functional project when it comes to security. But on the other hand, you could say, well, for a newcomer, I wouldn't say that people are not friendly. They're friendly, but you basically need to go and subscribe to a mailing list to start interacting with the developers. Maybe you go to IRC. And so we're very, very far from more recent projects or projects that rely on, let's say, I don't know, Mattermost and Telegram, and also a combination of IRC, and they're all going to be based on a GitLab instance, for instance, or they're going to have their code on GitHub. So I think this is all this is different. In some respect. But if you have everything if you see a project that's run down, you can also think that maybe the security process is not going to be that good, and that the software itself, not being well maintained, will therefore not being well maintained in terms of. I think there are
there are. When you talk about security of open source projects, you have to take in also maybe the wider context of the project as well. Is there an active team? Are there good communication channels?
Yeah.
Is the code easy to use? Because if the code is kind of complex and you install it and it creates kind of security risks because it's complex and you don't know it so well. While the code itself might not be called insecure, the usage of the code, unless it's by an expert, creates a security problem.
Absolutely.
So it's a wider question, I guess.
Yeah, and there's also the question of the very nature of the software itself. If you do hypervisor and that you're into hypervisor security, you're dealing with essentially vulnerabilities that are not really accessible to the 15-year-old hacker who has decided to run a prank or to do some sort of financial fraud. This isn't at all the same thing. If you're running, an Office suite, for instance, an open source project that develops an Office suite, you're going to be tempted to say that unless there's a vulnerability affecting document files and document formats, you're not going to be super proactive because, frankly speaking, nobody cares about, that's the only thing you care about, essentially, which is can that affect documents, user documents. So I'd say the perimeter is fundamentally relative and respect specific to the kind of software you're developing. Well,
thank you.
Any more questions? We've got a couple of minutes. Hey, thank you very much again, Charles, for your time. It was a really interesting talk. Next week, I think we've got a speaker still to TBD, so keep a lookout on OpenUK's social media to see who'll be speaking next week. Is it going to be you?
John Laban. No, it's not me. I think it's John Laban talking about the circular economy.
Great. So that'll be the same time next week, 12 to 1. So hopefully we'll see some of you there. Thanks very much. And thanks again, Charles.
Thank you.